Okay, so hello there, Lee. Thanks for taking the time.
Hi, Jude. Glad to be here.
So yeah, I'm really excited to have a chat to you today, as we have obviously had a little bit of a conversation beforehand, and I thought a really exciting provocation came out of the discussions, which was what if Picasso had gone to the moon? And we're going to get into why we sort of using that as a working title. But I should perhaps sort of just briefly introduce that you're a creative consultant and an adjunct faculty at Parsons School of Design. You work in fashion, couture, and also a strategist in design and technology. So I'd love it if you could just give us obviously a little bit of background as how to you even got into that position, and then we can jump into the crazy Picasso stuff.
That sounds great. Yes. I love this topic of framing fashion in the context of the space industry for a couple of reasons. One being that fashion tech is really the conversation of the moment and how technology is integrating in every aspect of our lives, wearable technology, e-commerce, all of this. But what does it mean for the future of the fashion industry? And if we frame it through the lens of a kind of forward-looking industry like space that's kind of in a new renaissance, then we can look ahead at to what's possible and maybe plan some steps that can help us get there a little bit more intentionally. So as a creative way of thinking of fashion strategy and also kind of provoking some really fun questions.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's just to frame this for anyone who's thinking, well, hold on, I'm a product designer, or I came here for product design. Why are we suddenly talking about fashion? I think there's like a really nice example which stayed with me in the early part of my career, which was around that I kind of always thought Formula One was a very decadent, excessive, over the top thing. And then it was when someone pointed out to me who worked at McLaren and was like, yeah, but you do realize that a lot of the technology that is developed at that level then cascades down into the mass consumer market. And indeed, the two industries have quite a symbiotic relationship of how the innovation supports the quality of that product. And so for me, that was sort of an interesting recognition of how two things that seemed disconnected were actually very closely intertwined. And I guess we were using that as a little bit of a connection indeed to how fashion and couture worked with mass market clothing.
Definitely. And I love that you bring up that example. I recently got interested in F1 for that exact reason. And I follow, of course, the drivers and all of the drama is great, but watching really those drivers push these machines to the limits to be able to develop technology in that we'll all kind of be touching in a way is really exciting to me. And there are a lot of parallels. I'll show some examples as we go through this from fashion as well, and how that this high-end kind of explorative and maybe conceptual design process can then filter back or help us take like a leap ahead in what's a more traditional product development process.
Terrific. Yeah, let's jump into the slides.
Well, I we'll start here with a timeline. I really like to show on one hand that this isn't really a new conversation. And if you see at the beginning of the timeline here back in the 1960s, the fashion industry has always really had a hand in the space industry, whether it's constructing boots for the astronauts on the moon or their suits. And it was originally a bra company that was contracted to make these suits because they had a specific expertise. And I think that parallel really carries through to today. And we'll see some of those examples also. Space age fashion, all of this that really just speaks to how fashion is able to use the current moment and what's happening in society and culture and translate that in this awesome, compelling visual way. I don't know, we can look at some of the really functional examples like the Velcro and the pockets that are used in the actual astronaut attire, like Sally Ride's pants, the blue in the middle over here on the left. And then right next to that, this Terry Mugler look, which you can see is the kind of exact opposite, not functional, but purely the sci-fi aesthetic that's being brought into just the zeitgeist of the moment. I could spend kind of an hour talking about just this slide. But I also want to point out here, I think when you get into the later years, we have an opportunity really for some marketing campaigns. You'll see like Louis Vuitton mentioned, Stella McCartney and Bolt Threads, down Buzz Aldrin with that American flag, kind of a modern version of the American flag, which I guess is future forecasting when we have settlements on Mars and all this. But and then Nicole Stott, most recently, an astronaut featured in a Super Bowl ad. So all of this is really new and speaking to how space is, it's a captivating topic, and that fashion and space in this way are really good vehicles for communicating.
And it's strange, isn't it? Because I think one of the things we ended up sort of discussing a little bit was this notion that I hadn't really considered it before. But when I think of Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey, I remember thinking, gosh, I was completely blown away at the detail of the fashion and the interior design and so many of these things. And actually, it was only when you were sort of mentioning all this that I thought, actually, the spacesuits were quite sort of traditional. They weren't quite as radical in the leap forward. And so you wonder almost a little bit, these things are artistic, and so they are, of course, a product of the imagination. And it's not to say that Kubrick was going slack on the spacesuit design, but it's just interesting how certain things develop certain urgencies. And when we look at sort of some of the stuff with Virgin Galactic, as you said, and SpaceX, and even recent films like The Martian, things, it's fair to say, are much more tailored, much more fitted. And so I kind of wonder, what's your perspective on the push and pull of the fiction and the reality?
Well, I can skip ahead here a little bit.
Yeah, we can jump back and forward. It's all good.
We'll jump back and forth. That's great. Yeah. So just because this came up, I think I personally look at this suit as kind of where we would like to get, where we would like to be if we're really truly to have economies and people living and working in these new environments. Just that added mobility and almost a knitwear aspect to it. And when you see how far we are from that today, this is the most recent spacesuit that was revealed by NASA. These are the two Artemis suits. The one in the middle there, the red, white, and blue, is their EVA suit. And still, it's a massive kind of vehicle. It is a vehicle that humans have to survive inside. But one of the demos that they did when they were presenting this was that she bent over and picked up a rock on the stage just to show the dexterity of the gloves and the mobility of the suit. And you can see these kind of ball-bearing structure of the elbow. But look at that the waistline there. So you can see these modular pieces that are getting put together so that this suit can fit any shape or size astronaut. And much different from this kind of custom knit piece that we see from The Martian. But, I think another interesting aspect, and we kind of touched on this before, but the helmet is the thing that just has not changed.
It is, isn't it?
Right? It's completely different from the shoulders down, but yeah, we can't get away from this kind of this globe, plexiglass
and
globe.
It's kind of strange because we sort of always assume that that we're always going to have this visor, whereas in some ways you almost think, would it not end up being more like Daft Punk, where it's actually a blacked out thing, and maybe it's just cameras looking, and you might think, but the cameras won't be high enough resolution, but you think, hold on a minute, like Huawei is easily at 50 megapixels right now, so I'm quite sure it is capable of doing it. And then it's a question of, well, hold on a minute, our eyes also have limitations. We can't see in low light. We certainly can't see in infrared. We certainly can't see in like weird electromagnetic radiation storms that might be coming our way from solar flares. So actually, when I look at, Matt Damon's helmet, I'm like, yeah, that's kind of just one part of the spectrum compared to what is really out there with cameras.
Totally. I wonder when we'll get to that point where there's a lot more functionality built into that piece of the equipment or
but of
something.
Course, the truth is it makes for a terrible movie, right? maybe therein
we
is
just
the
haven't
answer.
gotten there yet. Yeah. I do. I wish that I had brought in. I show sometimes in. Let's see if I'm going to exit this really quickly just to get to
Yeah.
the. I love showing the dragon suit from SpaceX.
Yeah.
To me, so he hired a costume designer from Hollywood to help design this, which is, I think, is super smart on his end. He just understands that this kind of sexiness has to come through if we're all going to get excited about this future space industry and our lives in space. But this is definitely a Daft Punk look. I've seen like pictures of Daft Punk from the Grammys where they're basically wearing this outfit 10 years ago. So I think that parallel is really fun too. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Yeah.
And it's so strange, isn't it? How, we go through these shifts of where, I guess one of the things I hadn't really thought to ask is why is it that we always assume that space is about minimalism and not an excess? Because I mean, it's weird. It's like even in Star Trek, there was color, but it was still functional because it sort of implied rank or something. But it wasn't just like Captain Kirk got out of bed one day and felt like you'd just wear a blue one. That didn't happen. He was always yellow or whatever it was. And so I wondered, why is it that almost script writers haven't felt the need that dressing in the same white and various shades of grey, I mean, is that healthy, do you think? Is that actually like sustainable?
Yeah. I mean, I love this question too. And I have done some research in why uniformity is such a strong theme in the sci-fi fashion and sci-fi aesthetic. There are definitely safety reasons why things are white or orange or whatever.
Sure.
So that in these, at least the flight suit and the launch suits and the EVA suits. But beyond that, when it comes to sci-fi visions where people are actually living and working in space, I think that this is just an assumption, but because we're so based in, it's a government infrastructure right now, and some aspect of the military and that uniformity, and as government employees, there isn't a sense of I'm bringing my fashion aesthetic with me to space. It's like I have a uniform that I wear. And when we think of these future space, whether it's communities or living off planet or just on spacecraft, it's almost a military structure on those crafts. So it carries through a sense of uniformity and minimalism. And this goes back, if we look at the space age fashion with Pierre Cardin, for example, he had a mission to design for this future that doesn't exist yet. But for him, it was about equality. And this is kind of the beginning of women's liberation and just a sense of trying to bring everyone forward on equal footing. So uniformity to him really meant equality. So his designs, which then inspired Star Trek, were uniform because of that. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but these are some of the dots that I've been sort of connecting.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, this is always the big question is, whether fashion is reflecting society or whether fashion is provoking society to change. And,
Definitely.
I don't want to answer that. I'd like you to jump into that. What's been your observations?
I mean, I'm going to go here for this because I think Alexander Mcqueen, these two examples. So this is Sholem Harlow during the Alexander Mcqueen Fall/Winter 2019 show, or 1999 show, sorry. So Y2K. And here, to me, he's addressing kind of a fear and anxiety in society about how we're going to be interacting with technology and machines. So he's using fashion here as a vehicle for kind of expressing what we are feeling. Whereas in the same year, he was working for Givenchy, and this is the piece from his Givenchy Haute Couture collection, the same season, Fall/Winter 1999, so same Y2K, this sense of technology that's coming through. But here, he's almost proposing a future. So even in this one designer took two very different approaches to how he could use fashion to communicate around what we're feeling right now with technology, but also what possibilities there are. So I hope that kind of speaks to the question you just posed.
Yeah, and I think it's always. I mean, McQueen's such an interesting example in that he's always walked this line of deliberately being provocative, but I think always with a sense of agenda, and that there was something which he was trying to work through. And I think sometimes it's a little unfair to say that an artist has to be able to reconcile all disparate thoughts and ideas all in one fashion, because you think, well, if you applied that same thing to a product designer, that would be quite a high bar to set as well. So I guess when I was sort of looking at sort of the picture with the robots spraying, it's the fact that obviously the model has been prepped to look slightly sort of distressed, and that it's somewhat of a violation. She's definitely being dominated by the machine rather than it being a dance between her and the machine.
Yes.
And so I sort of, when I saw that, I thought it's quite a dystopian view. And you could say that almost the sort of the spraying of the paint is somewhat, it's very different than if it was, say, delicately embroidering, or that it was doing something with high precision, a bit like a surgical robot. It's almost sort of quite brutal. And I mean, I can't remember, I don't know his work extensively, but I think this was after he had done things like the Highland Rape, was it? And so I think he was going to some quite aggressive places with society's treatment of women as well, let's face it. So the fact that he was probably reading into Silicon Valley and saying, well, Silicon Valley really hasn't spent a lot of time being particularly equal in all senses, I think it's quite reasonable to infer that he probably had a dim view of how things were going to play out. So I guess to hand it back to you, where do you think these sorts of messages from fashion are helping influence people in design? Because obviously that's a big part of your work as a design strategist.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it really does come from both sides that you were just describing. Really, there is a dystopian future we can imagine, and a lot of designers in the fashion industry take that approach and have this vision of the future. And that sometimes is just means there's no color. Sometimes it means the materials are kind of deconstructed and torn. Here, I think the play with technology to express that dystopian future really speaks to how inescapable it is at this point. So she's, not to really overanalyze this image and this specific example, but if we think about this moment right now, we're almost at another inflection point with technology in the space industry. So how do we can think of a million ways that could go wrong. There was the Outer Space Treaty signed in 1959 decided with 187 nations, I'm pretty sure it was every nation that signed it, that space was non-sovereign territory. We cannot claim land in space. It is the global commons. And then within the past couple of weeks, there was an executive order from the United States saying that actually the United States doesn't see space as the global commons within the same year as the forming of the Space Force. So there's this side of you can easily project that to a dystopian future where space becomes a military war zone, or we could try and look at it from kind of this more, I think, harmonious existence. And it's also probably a good time to talk about the space station and how the one platform that we have in space right now really represents the best or one of the most successful international collaborations that humans have ever achieved, that came out of, a really scary time. So maybe what we see right now could lead to the same type of outcome. I don't know, but
I mean, would you almost agree as well that one of the things I find quite difficult, sort of having tried to sort of bring the shock of the new to companies that are maybe just trying to get their head around something, is that often I sort of find it sometimes easier to write the dystopian future than it is to write the utopian. It's actually quite hard to put a coherent polemic that that says it's going to be all right. I think it's actually easier to sort of chip away at our fears and insecurities and taboos. And so
Right.
I actually quite admire, as much as it's quite dated, I think Star Trek was actually quite an incredible thing from Gene Roddenberry, I think it's the name. Actually really seeing races, people coming together. And to your point with America, that space was governed, in a very egalitarian, equal way, rather than putting flags in in sand, as it were.
Right.
I think the space station's an incredible place to start.
Right. And to your point about it being easier to maybe extend the dystopian vision rather than the ideal or utopian vision, I think it feels better sometimes too. As a creative, we want to process our fears and anxieties through the work. So that is one way that it really manifests. But when we think about the ideal future, we can also sound very naive. So I think right now I pose that question. This is a little bit of an abstract way to frame it, but these images to me really represent culture and the richness of culture on Earth, the color, the texture, its flavors, it's multi-sensory, and how does that end up being translated into this kind of stark environment that you've described well, I think, in this conversation. And even if people can visualize Stanley Kubrick's vision of that future, it is very stark. So if fashion can help in a way be a positive force in that discussion about carrying culture forward, that to me represents the best of this effort to set intentions of a future we want to arrive at and then taking the steps to get there. And that's how I kind of frame this in my own research and in the way I'm asking these questions.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess it's just it's one of those things where I remember us discussing a little bit about this thing with Neil Armstrong being the first man on the moon. And forgive me, I'm probably going to get torn apart in comments if I get this wrong, but I think I understand that there's a good chance that he didn't write or pen the immortal line of one small step for man, and in some ways I kind of feel that that's probably just being realistic, that you've got someone who at the end of the day is human, and he is obviously an incredible talent to have done what he did in the first place. That's more than most people will ever achieve in a lifetime. So to put on the burden on top of him that he has to also be a poet and an orator, and that he has to sort of capture the essence of something whilst actually being probably his heart going at a rate of that we can't even believe as he's stepping onto the moon, then it sort of feels like, gosh, do we expect too much of an individual that they have to also do this? And so I think surely the answer is not we have to have a superhuman person, which is always inachievable in some respect, but is it that we do actually need a collective? And so I guess that was why we were using this sort of provocation of what if Picasso had gone to the moon? Would he have articulated things differently than, say, a more technical scientific background person might have done? So I wonder where did that take you on your journey?
In my thoughts right now, I brought this image up because this is Ed White. He was the first American to do a spacewalk. And if Ed White was not an artist, and at this point, I read The Right Stuff again recently, and Tom Wolfe is amazing at telling the story of these pilots who were scouted and trained to take these amazing risks. But Ed White did not want to come back in the spacecraft. There are recordings of Houston saying, like, all right, it's time to come in. You might die out there if you don't get back in right now. And he's like, just one more moment. And that to me, that if you can put an artist or someone who has a means of expressing what they experienced that day in his shoes, then not only are you inspiring people just through the fact that this was possible, but you're able to spread a message in through different means of communication that can really make a broad impact on society. And so one other example was, during early orbits of the moon, I cannot remember which astronaut it was, I'm sorry, but he started seeing these like bright, almost like fireflies flying by the windows of the rocket, and he's like, this is amazing, what's happening? It's like this phenomenon that like humans have never witnessed before. And it turns out it was part of the shell that was kind of burning off as it was traveling super fast through space. But before we knew that, he was just like, his mind was blown by this visual experience he was having. And again, these are the types of things where we can't predict what we're going to see when we're taking these new adventures, but to have people there who can carry back that message and communicate it through art or poetry, I think that we need that as a society to help us take the right steps. Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't expect to get into this discussion, but you're almost conjuring up a sort of slight, I don't know what to call it, but a dichotomy almost, you could say, with sort of Timothy Leary and say like the whole LSD thing of just, on the one hand, it felt like he was embarking on something that he wanted to be able to share. And it felt like he was able to share with some of the audience. And it's, this isn't a pro or anti-drug message. The point is about communication. And that he was obviously successful in engaging one group of people who got it and wanted to embrace what he was grappling with or trying to express. And then another, it just felt like it was way out or far out and crazy and going to bring about the end of civilized society. Economies would collapse. There was a lot of fear around what he was provoking. And it sort of feels like this does resonate a little bit with sci-fi and indeed fashion, of that in some ways you could almost say the avant-garde is quite dangerous to a lot of people. And I just wondered, what were your reflections on why we fear something which was at the end of the day is no different than a hypothesis in a scientist's head? Yeah. Or an experiment, you could say.
Right. I love that. I'm going to pull this up just to have the, let's see. So Pierre Cardin designed, I love this look that the model is wearing, because it's like the chicest astronaut that could possibly be. And then Pierre Cardin got to visit and try on an actual spacesuit, which I'm sure for him was the best moment of his life. But this idea for him that he's designing clothes, inventing for a life that doesn't exist yet, he is hypothesizing. He is imagining a potential future, and in an idealist way, designing for that best outcome in his mind. Part of that is using new materials and new manufacturing processes that were possible at the time. So he's experimenting not only in the aesthetic, but also actually materially making new things, new business models, all of that. But there's a huge amount of experimentation that comes, I think, with a designer who is inherently looking towards a future and designing with that in mind, that doesn't necessarily happen with a lot of the fashion that we wear every single day. Like my favorite sweater and my favorite pair of jeans aren't provoking this same type of discussion. So we need fashion designers who do engage that deeply on this conceptual level and start to push those boundaries where that can translate back into something really utilitarian. But for the purposes of this creation from Pierre Cardin, it doesn't have to from him. Someone else can take what he's done and reinterpret that, whether it's an aesthetic or it's actual technology. So I think it sort of makes sense to go back and look again. Sorry for jumping really around. Cool. So we've seen this from Alexander Mcqueen for Givenchy, and relevant to bring in how these things actually make sense in the real world, and that there's meaning behind them, not just as kind of fluffy design experiments, but LED in clothing. This is just one example, and I could have brought in others, but has a real function, whether it's for work or for fitness in the dark in cities where we're vulnerable. Bikers. There's been a lot of technology around bikers and creating like reflective strips, and 3M has been really forward thinking on this as well. But also in the outdoors for backpackers or any place where we go where we are potentially in danger. These solutions can make us safer. So that to me is a kind of the best way that we start to see some of this kind of futuristic feeling technologies start to have a real purpose. Whether or not I need this in my jacket that I wear when I'm going to work, probably not, but it doesn't have to be in everything. I think that's another misconception of some fashion technology, is that unless it becomes as ubiquitous as the iPhone, then it's not really relevant. But that to me is kind of a standard that's too high. We just have to find the right places where it really does have a huge value add.
Yeah, and I think why is it that we have this relationship for things to be, jaw-dropping or sort of earth-shatteringly impactful, and that gets bestowed innovation. Yet quite often, when you look back at the trajectory of a lot of new technology, it usually had lots of fits and starts, misfires, and the market, as much as everybody likes to think that they love the word disruption, they love the word new, history would say you don't. And that it takes a lot of coaxing by really clever marketeers, because last time I checked, the product never does sell itself just on a purely utilitarian value. It always has to come with a story, with a proposition that we can make sense of it. And indeed a context, as you said. I'm sure that it's reasonable to say that these things were probably a convergence of cycle safety becoming an increased problem because more cyclists were taking to the road, whilst at the same time the technology and textiles of quality of garments, the ability to weld seams together that had really incredible performance against the elements, all of this felt like, for me, that was converging, and so this thing felt a natural iteration rather than a shock. And so I wondered, could you tell us a little bit about, what are the things that conspire to make great fashion come down from the avant-garde into the mainstream?
So I think you touched on one of the most important parts, which is that innovation and technology advancements are happening in a lot of different areas at the same time, and they have to converge. But that also requires these different groups to be communicating. So speaking just for a moment to the importance of having multidisciplinary teams and interdisciplinary teams to be sharing these competencies with each other. And then a fashion team is no longer just made up of the textile designer and the fashion designer. They're also made up of the 3D printing CAD designer and the material scientist, and that list goes on. But also the psychologist on the marketing team, bringing in these areas that might seem outside of that competency, but then can actually open up new ways of trickling it down to create that business case, I guess. So you have something that's very speculative as a proof of concept, where like a 3D printing of a new material that has a little bit more flexibility, for example, that might not, if it walks down the runway for Iris Van Herpen as a dress, the way that material ends up on the market might not be as a dress, but that 3D printing manufacturer now has a new product that they can start to find different applications for in different industries. So I guess I'm thinking of how innovation in fashion can impact our daily lives. It's not always going to be through more mainstream fashion, because I think the future of the fashion industry holds a lot of opportunity for teams that are interacting with suppliers and technologists that have their hands in other industries as well. So that might have taken us off course a little bit, but that's one way that I see that impact kind of trickling down.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned philosophers then. I mean, do you feel that almost as a consultant, do you find yourself saying, look, I appreciate that you've got this technologist and this expert in all the materials thing covered, but that you say, actually, we desperately need someone with, poetic capability, or someone who can translate what it means to a product or an experience or a service, let's say. I mean, do you find that something that your black book has to go beyond just material science these days? Sorry, it's actually hailing now. So audio, apologies for the audio, but please carry on. I'll just mute and listening.
Okay. So to that point of bringing in these different people, it also has expanded the research and reading that I am doing. So I read the typical kind of Business of Fashion, Harvard Business Review, but then I think there's a new meaning that's, for me, coming from reading science fiction books. For example, like I read The Three-Body Problem recently, and the way that it's not just a book about technology, it's a book about society and culture. Tying that back into product strategy, this sounds very far-fetched, but trying to understand the motivations of people who are coming to the website of a client that I'm working with, for example. What are they actually looking for? And we've had a lot of conversations about this recently. I can't believe COVID-19 hasn't come up yet in this conversation, but right now it's a totally different experience that someone is looking for when they're product hunting. And there's a comfort level in going back to brands that you know well and that you trust, but we're also interacting with our belongings very differently at this point. So I think now more than ever, understanding the psychology and the reason why a choice is being made by a customer around a product. Because at the end of the day, working in the fashion industry, we sell products. That's what we do, and it's physical products that people have to. It's a different thing than buying something digital or virtual. And I sort of lost my train of thought there, but the conversations we're having now, whether or not we've brought in an actual psychologist to those conversations, have a lot more to do with those motivations and understanding which products are the right ones to be developing, what we've canceled versus what we think might be pushed forward or started sooner, has totally changed. And I don't think that this is just a reaction to the moment. I think it's something that ends up getting much more ingrained into product strategy moving forward, to really be thinking about the customer and what they're looking for versus what makes sense based on past trends or past product strategy. It's a looking forward versus looking back.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, the looking forward versus looking back, that's such an interesting tension that we, it's all too often we think that we're on the bleeding edge of something, and that when you reframe it, you realize how many times this has happened in history. So it's it's always interesting when you sort of look back at some of those things. But I guess it's interesting how you sort of, I don't know whether I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it feels like there's a high probability that there will be, jobs that don't yet exist yet or aren't as well known as maybe a design philosopher or a experienced psychologist, in product design. It feels like those jobs are on the cusp of being, I guess you could say like social media manager. I genuinely have a friend who had that job probably about 8 years ago, and he was usually sort of just, people would smirk when he sort of announced his title, and you could see it. And yet I kind of feel actually trying to decode very new experiences, such as going to space, I just don't even believe the general public are really ready for it, in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. So it takes people, for whether you like Elon Musk or not, it takes people like that to help explain it and break it down. So I guess what would you say is the future? Do you think it is going to be led by people who are these standout people who have the cash to just run at ideas?
So I've been thinking a lot about thinking and talking to people doing some a lot of research on the business of space to understand that question exactly. Like, are we just relying on billionaires to push this forward? And it's billionaires or the government. And I also then go back to my own kind of value system and philosophy around fashion, where I really wish that things were planned on a longer timeline and that there were more incentives to do things and invest in things that are have long-term returns instead of looking for the short-term gains for shareholder value, all this stuff. So this is one area where I think space becomes extra valuable in a conversation in society right now, where you have to think long-term because those projects just take a long time. It takes years to test something once before you figure out what's wrong with it, and then you have to build it again and test it again. So if we can accustom people to that pace and that type of planning and patience, I guess, in that cycle, then that might trickle down into other industries like fashion and change our mindset or this growth mindset that has probably kind of outpaced itself at this point. And we could cite some conversations like the CEO roundtable from this past year where I think for the first time since its inception, they decided that shareholders were not going to be the biggest priority anymore. And that was, it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to actually put that into action. But it's a pretty big commitment to make. And if that is where we are as a society, I think it's a good time to have a conversation about the fashion cycle and frame that in this long-term view.
I guess sort of do you suppose that there's, I mean, I guess all businesses, all societies have a sort of degree of a cyclic feel to them, and that things go through an ebb and flow. At the minute, I remember seeing a sort of slightly snarky graph that was talking about a thing called earnings calls, as in how many times, venture capitalists mention things in various publications around finances. And they were talking about the word unprecedented. And it was like obviously a huge spike because people were saying we're in unprecedented times. And then, of course, you reframe it back to 2008. And then it's a stark reminder that you go, oh, yeah, so they are unprecedented. But we have short-term memory. We are goldfish, in terms of the grand scheme of things. So yeah. I guess it's not that I'm trying to call the fashion industry goldfish, but it's probably fair to say that it has a hell of a speed. Like quarterly in a year is completely norm at the minute. And so I wonder, how do we, I mean, maybe I'm asking the wrong question, but I'm going to try it anyway, of just how do we adjust our whatever you want to call it, need for something new and shiny every quarter of a year? And is it that we truly can make a sort of viable business about us saying something that you buy it, it's long term, and it becomes endowed, or it morphs, or it reconfigures in some way? I mean, at the most simple level, the reversible jacket or the reversible belt is somewhat altering, at least, halving, should we say, a fashion cycle. but it's quite hard to do anything more than that. So what do you think the future is when there is this pressure to be more socially and in terms of the planet, more responsible?
So I've a few thoughts on that, and I hope I don't end up going down a rabbit hole in responding. But one thing that comes to mind is lifetime warranties, and how at some point planned obsolescence across industries became a thing. We expected things to expire or to break and then to have to replace them. But companies like LL Bean or Patagonia offering to repair things for you. We send it back, you'll get a new one for certain products. That's really meaningful at this moment in time. I hope that other companies could start to make that promise, because if they made that promise, they would have to, the quality of their products would have to go up. So it would, there could only good can come from that. It doesn't make sense for every business, but for a lot it could. Another thing is, with us all being at home right now and thinking about, and everyone around the world, I think one of the most interesting things about this is that we are all experiencing this together. So we have global supply chains in fashion that where, it's a kind of funny and super annoying thing when Italy shuts down for a month in the summer. So you're a business in New York, but you have to plan for Italy's vacation kind of thing. So you have to get your orders in for the mills and all of that. But now, we've all shifted. Those factories are closed, but we're all still kind of working together to see who can get what where to make supplies for people who need it. It's just totally shifted the conversations that we're having. So that's super interesting, because it makes you think, like, what do we actually need right now? So I mean, how much do we have that we're just not using because our interactions in the world have changed? And I think that will carry forward for a lot of people, maybe not everyone. It might not be enough to shift our relationship with fashion and with fast fashion, but there will be a piece of that gets carried forward. So I'm curious to see how brands use that as an opportunity to slow down. Can they take it on themselves to say, wow, this was actually really good for us. We were able to be more thoughtful about this decision, this partnership, this product line. A lot of companies are completely scrapping an entire season of products that would have been, in a lot of ways, we just don't need that stuff now. So, and it's stuff. It's just. I think that's where the fashion industry is up against some really tough decisions about what happens afterwards. And I've been thinking about the idea of going back to normal, or when things go back to the way that they were, but that's just that doesn't exist for us anymore. So the companies that I think are taking this as an opportunity to make that long-term plan, take this time of pause to make a long-term plan for change, is probably where I'll end that rabbit hole, because I lost probably the other piece that I wanted to respond to your question with.
Well, maybe I could. I guess there's two things that maybe come to mind, and then feel free to jump in if it comes back to you. One is, are you familiar with the Diderot effect?
I am not.
Okay, so I'll quickly go over that. So I don't know the guy's first name, so I'm showing myself up here. But anyway, such and such Diderot, he basically lived in this sort of rather shambolic, sort of sounds very sort of Oscar Wilde-y type room, a little bit dilapidated, but kind of, charismatic at the same time. And anyway, he got this new smoking jacket, and then he realized that as soon as he got this rather beautiful, lush, new smoking jacket, everything else suddenly looked rather disheveled and shambolic and dilapidated. And so it put this sort of pressure on him to then, bring everything up to the same standard as his rather lovely smoking jacket. And so it sort of was expressing this need for us to say, it's not actually that everything else around us was broken and defunct. You were fine. It's just there's something that when we put contrast in our lives, it heightens our awareness of it. And I mean, I guess you could say that it's the same principle as keeping up with the Joneses. You were fine until your neighbours got a flashier car, a better haircut, a nicer dress. And so is it that really we're quick to blame fashion when really the problem is us? Or is it that fashionistas are exploiting the inherent tendencies? So it feels like a dance to me rather than an easy blame.
Right. It's definitely two-sided. And I think this is a conversation at Parsons is really trying to ingrain a sensibility for sustainability within the students. And this conversation comes up all the time where there's, this is my budget, this is what I can afford, and it is fast fashion. So am I supposed to, what do I do with that? And then am I supposed to change my behavior before the brand does so that they have to change because no one's buying their products anymore? Which comes first, I do not know. I do know that from my belief that the fashion industry does lean into this tendency of the consumer. And that's where, like, if looking at marketing campaigns and things, I mentioned that Nicole Stott Super Bowl ad from Olay, and it's silly and maybe gimmicky, but a lot of the proceeds for that product went to STEM education. I think if you're going to promote a product and you can also just have that positive message associated with it, then that's one step closer, I think. And having this female astronaut as a figurehead in that campaign, along with like a YouTube star and a model or whoever else were the other actors or ambassadors in it, that's pretty cool. And there are opportunities like that to use that influence, and yes, they're going to sell products because of it, but I think having that message out there is better than some of the other ones that I've seen, I guess. So there are ways to still market to people, get them to want to buy stuff and sell your product while also putting out a message that can be constructive in a different way, I guess. So that's one way I could respond to that.
I mean, it is terribly difficult for companies just to be, not to sort of let them off the hook, but I mean, even, everybody's pet favorite in product design of Apple, I distinctly remember getting a laptop by Apple and it being forever till they released a new variant. And it was like perfectly good, and all the software was designed to still work with that machine. You didn't have to trade up because it wasn't performing. And so it feels the same with, now we're at the stage where they're just sort of continually churning out new stuff. And I don't think I'm being, it's not that I'm a fanboy or a critic, but it's fair to say that it's quite incremental, the difference between the phones. It hasn't got this like, oh my God, it's a completely different thing. It's like a bit faster, and the only reason you need it a bit faster is because the apps are just hungry for it. So I guess the thing that I'm kind of curious, forgive me if I'm going off on a tangent here, but there was something you said a while back about the physicality of things. And I wondered, have you got into much the space of sort of, commodities and consumables in digital? So things like EVE Online, Second Life, these sorts of things, where truly vast sums of real physical money have been spent in a digital platform on things which are, ephemeral. Do you own it? But then, I guess without getting too sort of, Timothy Leary about it, then how different is it really owning a Technicolor Dreamcoat on EVE Online as it is buying something by Givenchy or whoever, which is also impractical and one-off, So
yeah, I think a good example to bring up here is digital fashion, and there was an auction for a dress that sold for like $10,000, and it was purchased using Bitcoin. Yeah. And it is not a real dress. It's this like cool holographic, almost transparent thing that you just superimpose on yourself in a picture. So it doesn't exist, but I think it was worth a lot just as an art piece, maybe as an experiment. I don't know. But there are companies that are selling virtual clothing, virtual apparel that for an influencer, for example, or if you want to be an influencer on Instagram, you have to change your outfit 3 times a day and do the photo shoots, whatever. If you can spend a few bucks to get some new things and just show your style and your aesthetic and express yourself in that way without having to invest in all of this stuff, I actually think that that's pretty cool. Not that I promote the culture of selfies and using your time that way or trying to validate yourself that way, that's a whole other conversation. But if you can use fashion in the same way that a lot of people who kind of have devoted their lives to the industry do, which is really as like you are a blank slate to be kind of like, I don't know what the words I'm looking for, but you decorate yourself with fashion and you put together compositions of color or shape or proportion or texture. And that's how you play with fashion, and you use that experience and you become kind of, your identity is built on the way that you use fashion to tell that story. And I think that's what has always inspired me about fashion so much too, is the versatility of it, and how each person, if you want to invest the time to do that, can come up with something totally different. I'll point everyone to look at like just different subcultures around the world, that even punk in Portland versus punk in London, totally different, but so many signifiers that were developed through like a really closely curated set of beliefs, but also materiality. So if we can get to that part without having to use the physical product, but we can still kind of embody it in the same way, I think it's new, but there's a lot of potential there.
I guess it's an interesting thing, and I guess I've sort of mused over this question on a couple of different angles, is that this thing around, we obviously have a sort of need to sort of fit in and conform, even if we're rebelling, let's say punk. You still notice a lot of punks hanging out in a group with other punks. So in many ways, they are a clique, even though they wouldn't self-identify usually as that. And so I think it's one thing to sort of say the psychologists can explain it better than me why that phenomenon exists. But I guess the bit that is kind of interesting with a digital life is that it truly is limitless. It's only limited by the amount of time you can dedicate. And even that, I would challenge myself to say, well, actually, there's an avatar where you are creating a one-to-one time relationship where you have to switch it on. But it could be that actually the person I'm speaking to now is actually just a sort of approximation of your personality, and actually I'm not speaking to you at all. This is an extrapolation of what you would have said to my question, and an AI is taking a guess. So, but what's interesting about it, sorry to try and form the question here, is that do you think having a multiplicity of expressions of who we are might help us understand better who we are or what we could be? Or is it just going to turn into a cacophony of nonsense and madness and decadence? Because the dystopian, as we said, is easier to write, right?
Right. No, I mean, I hope that the future looks like that. And I hope you touched on the iPhone changing all the time, and now I have to have the new iPhone. And fashion has created this whole, trends are just so much faster than they always were. You can look like through history, skirts go from like this long to like this short and then this long again. And it just like goes back up and down. And if you don't have the right length skirt, then you're clearly passé. If that can kind of change and people had just their own individual understanding of what the right thing was to wear today, just completely independent of what you're supposed to be wearing, I think the world would be a really fascinating place. I think people might be more confident. I think that there might still be a lot of sameness, but you also you can't get to that point when every company is producing the same stuff all the time. So if you go to Zara or you go to, well, not Barney's anymore, I guess, but to H&M or to Dior, you might find pretty much the same dress, just at a different price point with a little bit different material and maybe a cheaper zipper or something. But everyone is kind of looking the same because we're just being given the same products to consume, the same way we all have the same phone. So again, what changes first, consumer behavior or the product? I don't know. But there is maybe an interesting question in there around the small businesses, direct-to-consumer design, where brands and companies are focusing on a tighter set of products and being expert at that product instead of trying to deliver everything to everyone. And that, to me, is not only really cool as far as what we'll see about quality, but it's really cool because a lot of it is based in research and development and creating really strong relationships with your suppliers and developing materials that might be proprietary. And that is also a new potential business model for fashion. So this is, in my ideal world, fashion businesses don't only make money by selling products to people. They find other revenue streams. And I believe that research and development is one of those potential revenue streams. But it will take investment and a different strategy. So that's where I think my fashion hat and my design strategy hat probably come together the most. And then maybe a little bit of the futurist in there too.
Yeah. I mean, the digital side of things does, in some ways, sort of disrupt the conventional business model as well, because it moves away from saying you've bought a physical vinyl record to an MP3. And so suddenly then it becomes not about the how much does it cost to manufacture, but what is it that you're actually selling and why. And so I think it's interesting to consider that actually the digitization of fashion could possibly have the same disruption, because if, let's say, it is that 10,000 dress, I'm sure the first thing that people try to do is think, well, how do I copy it? Just right. Because humans have this, like, it seems like a sort of moth to a flame. We can't help but just go, I'm going to crack your code just because you set it up to be impenetrable. So right. It feels like, and I guess I'm sort of reminded of that scene. Forgive me for having very little pedigree in the field, but I still love the Devil Wears Prada sequence where, there was this sort of blue sweater that was kind of mediocre and a sort of, it doesn't have to be Primark, but let's just say at that level of cheapness. And she hadn't appreciated the lineage that had taken to bring that colour and that, indeed, the development, the R&D that had gone into it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that how can businesses remain fashionable, remain innovative, remain tastemakers when the ability to sort of hold on to that ability to charge a premium is like sand falling through their fingers right now?
Yeah, I think I wonder if it's necessary to have as much of a luxury market as we do. And that's my response to that statement or question. And there's always going to be a market for it and a customer base for it. But if it only works so much as people aspire to it. And I wonder what if even, luxury in the past has meant a huge amount of embellishment, logos everywhere. That has transitioned a little bit into a more minimalist sensibility, where if you have to have the logo, it probably means that you're not really living that lifestyle. That's what they want you to think if you're buying into this minimalist side. An understated luxury, and people have been writing about this for a little while, and I don't know where it leads for fashion, but I do know that there's a real struggle right now. I think Mcqueen, if we go back to that for a second, is a good example, being how he's in his own house, he can create this universe that is totally unique, and I think he'll be remembered for that. His business was fortunate that he had a partner who worked very closely with him and understood him, so that when he was devastatingly no longer there to continue the work, the business could continue with much the same ethos and aesthetic. But what happens after Sarah Burton isn't there anymore? Who takes the helm? And then how much is Alexander McQueen still Alexander McQueen? When he was at Givenchy, that kind of LED cyborg is very far from the Givenchy that did the costumes for Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Yeah.
Right. So what is the Givenchy brand anymore when it can be something different underneath the helm of any different creative director? All of the businesses that, the Givenchy, Saint Laurent, the Chanel, Karl Lagerfeld, like that transition, it takes so much meaning out of the brand when you have a creative director cycling in every couple of years, and the real vision behind what made it important in the first place isn't really there anymore. So I think that, yeah, we're at a real moment of transition for what those houses even represent at this point. I could go maybe back to the F1 example too, with Ferrari and Ferrari battling with Red Bull right now. The brand of Red Bull it's like crazy that this amazing heritage automaker is fighting for position against an energy drink. And what does that mean for luxury cars? So then, I'm sorry, I've got the train. It's more about the underlying technology that they're pushing forward, but what does the brand start to mean at this point? I don't know anymore. So I'm not sure where that really takes us, but
no, I just think you're making. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's a complex and nuanced thing to figure out, and I guess this is what I've really enjoyed about these conversations is we're not trying to just package this up so that we can put it on Instagram in a nice font and say, there you go, that's the relationship between product design, fashion, and commerce in general.
And space.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think it's interesting, should we say, for sort of people who don't consider themselves in the fashion industry to look at what things are ultimately governed by fashion, by tastemakers, by forces which aren't necessarily themselves. And I think you make such a great point in that last discussion of just saying, what is a brand when different creative influences cycle through? And that, you might be able to say, but it's our values, it's our ethos, but then ultimately, hold on, you've just brought in someone who does have a different ethos and a different set of values. So where does that leave you at that point? So I find that absolutely fascinating to challenge, especially when, I've worked for, family-run businesses, as it were, from Dyson, from Lego, to even small startups like Sugru. And it is a really big question of, well, hold on, that was the old guard. What is the new guard going to do? And you see companies lose their ways, brands lose their ways, and you see things, actually, the best is usually when they take the essence and take it somewhere new. So you could say that actually fashion, there's a lot to learn from fashion, to say fashion reinvents itself all the time by bringing in new talent, new capabilities, new technology, new experiences. So I think it's a really interesting point. And I guess I'm aware of time and that we could talk forever about this. But if there's anything else that we wished we hadn't talked about, we can always throw it in the links below.
Sure.
But I have to thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely extraordinary journey through all these different exposures and certainly much more than I would have expected it to have impact. So thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation and yes, all the rabbit holes that it took us down. So thanks, Jude.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Bye.